I don't remember choosing those thoughts or even those beliefs, but somehow they became the operating system of my life. And again, it didn't happen overnight. It just kind of happened one small decision at a time, one season at a time, one responsibility at a time, until eventually I stopped questioning these beliefs. And I think that's the part that catches most of us off guard. Well, hey, friend. So last week we talked about the moment when your "I'll just do a little more" stops working. And today I want to introduce you to the idea that changed how I really kind of see my entire life, not just my schedule, but the beliefs that are quietly running underneath it, beliefs I never actually chose. I'm choosing to call it default mode. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Curious about what it is? Well, stick around. That's what we're talking about today. So lately, I've been noticing something, and I'm curious if you have felt it too. That kind of tired that doesn't quite make sense. Not because you did something huge, but because there are just so many small things still sitting in your mind. Things you haven't finished, things you haven't decided, things that are still quietly asking something from you. I created something that explains what's actually going on underneath that feeling. It's a short guide called "The Losses Midlife Women Carry That No One Talks About," and it walks through why midlife can feel heavier than expected and what you may be carrying without even realizing it. So if this is something that resonates with you, you can grab it for free. Just go to midlifewomenlosses.com. Well, okay. So last week we talked about that moment that so many women eventually reach. It's the moment when "I'll just do a little bit more" stops working. And if you listened to that conversation, maybe you recognized yourself. Maybe you realized, you know what? Maybe it isn't just a busy week or a busy month or even a busy season. Maybe you realized this is how I have been living for years. That realization, it changed everything for me too, because once I stopped asking, why can't I keep up? A different question showed up. And that question is, why am I living this way in the first place? And I realized it wasn't because I wanted to live in that way. And I realized nobody forced me to live that way. But I was living that way because somewhere along the way, this way of living and this way of thinking became normal. And this really is what I'm calling default mode. If that phrase is new to you, don't worry. By the end of our time here together today, I think you'll recognize it instantly in places that you've probably never thought to look before. Know that default mode, it doesn't show up in a dramatic way. It isn't some sort of midlife crisis. It's kind of this quiet operating system that's running underneath almost everything you do. And most of us have never stopped to check whether it's actually the system that we would choose if we were building our lives from scratch today. So our conversation today really is the fifth and final installment in this series that we've been working on over the past few weeks. And I think it's probably the conversation that ties everything else together that we've talked about thus far. Everything that we've talked about, including the question that changed my decisions, right? The quiet resentment and the invisible cost of every yes. We talked about the strategy that often stops working for women. And all of those things that we've been talking about here lately, they come back to one thing. Most of us are not living lives that we are choosing intentionally. We are living the everyday by default. And today I want to show you exactly what that means and what it looks like so that you can start becoming aware of it. And I really want to be honest with you about something before we dive in. This conversation isn't going to hand you a 5-step plan to fix your life by Friday. It's going to hand you something quieter and I think more useful in the long run. And that is a lens. I love talking about how we see our lives and ourselves and the things that happen to us and the things that we choose through a lens. And so once you have the particular lens that we're talking about today, you will start seeing this default mode lens everywhere. You'll see it in your marriage. You'll see it how you handle your kids. You'll see it in how you handle your friendships. in the quiet assumptions that are kind of running your whole day. It's not a small thing, right? Being able to see this default mode everywhere is actually the beginning, kind of the building blocks of so many other aspects of our lives. So, know that if you've listened to our past few conversations, thanks for sticking with me through all of this, right? If this is the first one you're catching, that's okay too. Everything here will still make sense. And I hope that you feel compelled to go back and listen to the last 5 or so episodes here, because again, it's going to help give the foundation to a lot of what we're talking about here today. So here's something I've kind of been wrestling with. I don't remember waking up one day and deciding, you know what? I'm just going to make sure that everyone else's needs come before mine. Or I'll only rest when everything is finished. I don't think I also had made the conscious decision that I'll carry the mental load for everyone. And I'll believe that asking for help means that I'm failing. I don't remember choosing those thoughts or even those beliefs, but somehow they became the operating system of my life. And again, it didn't happen overnight. It just kind of happened one small decision at a time, one season at a time, one responsibility at a time, until eventually I stopped questioning these beliefs. And I think that's the part that catches most of us off guard. It's like we assume that if we're living a certain way, we must have decided to live that way at some point. Surely there was a moment where I sat down and thought, yes, this is how I want my life to operate. But when it comes to default mode for myself and the women that I work with, we often talk about default mode and we find them there too. We realize that there wasn't that moment in time, though. Nobody hands you a sort of contract to sign that says from now on, you're always going to put yourself last, and you will feel guilty every time you don't. These beliefs, they just kind of accumulate quietly out of 1,000 reasonable sounding moments until one day you look up and you realize that you're living according to rules that you never actually agreed to. And once you kind of see your daily operating system that way, something interesting happens. And that is that the frustration you might feel towards yourself, like, why do I keep living this way? And why can't I just change it? It starts to soften a little bit because you start to have that lens of understanding and that lens of compassion. I often talk about the lens of compassion, but you actually start to have that for yourself because you realize that you're not fighting against a decision that you made. You're essentially just untangling a pattern that built itself quietly without you ever noticing, without your permission, out of years of doing what seemed totally reasonable in each individual moment. This is what happens to really anyone, I think, who spends decades responding to life without ever getting a chance to pause and ask if the response is still even appropriate. So let's circle back to default mode because I touched on that a little bit, but I want to define it more clearly. When I say default mode, I'm not talking about routines or any form of execution on your part. It has nothing to do with what you do or don't do or how you do it. When I say default mode, I'm talking about the beliefs, right? It's an internal thing. It's the beliefs that quietly run your life without ever asking if they actually are still serving you. They're beliefs that say things like, if I don't do it, it won't get done. Or I should be able to handle this. Or I don't want to disappoint anyone. Or I'll rest later. Or this is just what good moms do. Have you ever noticed how those thoughts don't even sound like thoughts anymore? They sound more like facts. They're reality. And that's what makes them so powerful. When they sound like reality and we accept them as such, they have such a stronghold over us. Because the truth is, nobody questions a fact. You don't sit around wondering whether gravity is actually necessary today, right? Facts are just facts. And you build your entire life around accepting them without a second thought. And that's exactly what has happened with beliefs like, if I don't do it, it won't get done. Or if I don't do it, nobody else will. At some point, that belief, it stopped feeling like an opinion that you formed and started feeling like the basic architecture of reality. Again, it's just fact, which means that you've stopped examining it at all. You just live inside of it, the same way that you live inside gravity without ever asking if it's actually true anymore, or if it ever was. And here's what makes this concept so easy to miss. A belief that's true just 10% of the time can still feel like it's completely true 100% of the time. Once it's had enough years to just kind of take root and take ownership of your thought processes. It's like we become desensitized to it and we don't even notice thoughts like this anymore. Maybe there really was a season where if you didn't do it, it genuinely wouldn't get done. Maybe you had small kids, little to no help, no other option. And in reality, that belief, it actually made sense then. But beliefs don't come with expiration dates stamped on them. They just keep running quietly. If they're beliefs that we accept at one point, we just continue accepting them. And we accept them long after the circumstances that actually made them true have completely changed. When I started seeing this, I wish that I could tell you that there was one dramatic moment. There wasn't. It was dozens of tiny moments where I kind of started putting the pieces together. It was times when I caught myself saying yes before I ever considered whether I had the capacity. When I was automatically taking on the planning and the orchestrating and the figuring. And when I was feeling guilty if I sat down, thinking everyone else's preferences mattered more than mine. When I just did things because I'd always done them, not because I'd actually decided that they still made sense to do. And when all of these things kind of started to come together, it kind of hit me. And it hit me that I wasn't making intentional decisions anymore. I was living on autopilot. I was living out of habit. I was living based on expectations. I was deciding what I was going to do and not do from old beliefs. I was living on default. And I remember really one specific afternoon that kind of crystallized this for me. I had actually finished everything on my list for once, which was, again, it was an almost suspicious kind of quiet that had settled over the house. And again, my to-do list was all checked off. And instead of sitting down, instead of enjoying even just 5 minutes of that rare stillness, I found myself standing in the kitchen, scanning for something else to do, wiping a counter that didn't need wiping, straightening a stack of mail that was already straight. My body had actually run out of tasks, yet there was still a part of me that couldn't tolerate that. I needed to be doing something because doing something was the only way that I knew how to justify simply existing in that moment. And that's when I finally asked myself, why can't I just sit down? And the honest answer that came scared me a little bit. And it scared me because some old belief in me equated rest with laziness and productivity with worth. And I know that I am not the only woman to equate those two specific things. And the thing is that I hadn't ever really decided that that belief was true. I couldn't even tell you when those couple of thoughts actually kind of moved in and took residence in my brain. But these beliefs just kind of were quietly running for years, disguised as just being part of what it looked like to be a hard worker, just what it looked like to be responsible, just the kind of woman and mother and person who runs a household that knows how to get stuff done. And really what struck me most once I noticed it was how long these things had been quietly operating completely unchallenged. I didn't even know how long. I couldn't even, for as long as I could remember. And in reality, I had never once sat down and consciously thought, I believe that rest must be earned through exhaustion. If someone had said that to me directly, I probably would have disagreed with it in reality. But yet I was living it out. I was living that out every single day in every quiet moment. And whenever those quiet moments came, when I had a moment to catch my breath, I filled those moments with unnecessary tasks rather than allowing myself those few moments of stillness. And that gap between what I would have said I believed and what I was actually living is exactly what default mode looks like up close. Here's the thing. Default mode, it actually isn't bad. It probably helped you survive for a time. It helped you become dependable and responsible and capable. And it's probably one of the reasons that people come to you and that people trust you and that people ask you to do things. But surviving one season doesn't mean the same strategy should lead every season. And that's where so many of us get stuck. We confuse what feels familiar with being healthy. Just because something feels familiar doesn't mean that it's healthy or good or intentional. And I think this is one of the trickiest parts of default mode to catch, because when something feels familiar, it feels safe to us as humans. That's how we're wired. If something has always been true, some part of your brain assumes that it must be right. Otherwise, why would it have stuck around this long? But when it comes to belief patterns, longevity is definitely not the same as wisdom. A belief can run your life for 20 years and still be worth questioning on year 21. The fact that I should be able to handle this and other thoughts like this that have been quietly operating in the background of your entire adult life, just because they're there, it doesn't make them true. It just makes them well-seasoned thoughts and beliefs. I think about how differently we would treat this concept if it showed up anywhere else in our lives. And I'm talking about outdated things. If a piece of software that you had been running for 20 years started slowing everything down, you wouldn't assume that it must still be the right version simply because you'd used it for so long. You would update it. You would look for an update and you would say, hey, this isn't working properly. Is there an update? You'd ask whether something better exists now for what you actually need today. We just never think to apply that same basic logic to the beliefs that we're running our lives by, because they don't come with a little notification bubble telling us that an update is available. But friend, we are probably long overdue for an update. You are probably long overdue for an update. And old beliefs are sneaky because they don't announce themselves as such. Nobody walks around thinking, I currently believe that my needs matter less than everyone else's. We aren't consciously aware of that thought. It doesn't sound like a belief when you say it plainly. It actually sounds absurd. You would say, I don't believe that. But if you strip away that definition and that declaration, and you look instead at how you actually spend a typical Tuesday, you'd often find that belief in action. You would find that belief and others like them quietly steering every decision you make. And I think that's why this concept is so powerful. Habits are easy to spot and change once you notice them. But beliefs, they're much harder to catch because they've disguised themselves as reality rather than an opinion. They started as an opinion, but again, that opinion moved to fact at some point in your mind. And then fact becomes reality. Habits, we can see that pretty easily. And really, we can swap those out in a week, in a matter of a few weeks. But to unlearn a belief that has been quietly running your life in the background underneath everything for 20 years or more, now that is something different. And In order to do that, we don't need more willpower. We need what we're talking about today, which is an honest look. We need honest attention paid consistently over time to say, what is it that I actually believe? What is it that is shaping my reality? And so now that I've been having these insights for the past few years, when I catch myself rushing into an automatic yes or automatically saying yes to something or feeling responsible for something or feeling responsible for everything, I take a pause and I actually question. I ask a question. And a really smart question to ask is, am I choosing this or am I simply repeating the pattern that's always been here? And really, if you're willing to ask it, that question can become a mirror. It is for me. And when I ask it, sometimes the answer is, I absolutely want to do this. I want to do this. Wonderful, great, right? But oftentimes when I ask that question, I find that I am acting on guilt, or I am acting out of fear, or I am acting based on habit or what I've always done, or an old belief that I never stopped to examine. Awareness is key, but awareness doesn't instantly change your life. But it does give you something that you've been missing if you let it, and that is a choice. If you choose to see that you've got outdated beliefs and outdated ways of doing things without questioning them, if you've got that awareness, then the door is open to choosing for you too. So let me give you a real example of how this could play out. Let's say that someone asks you to bring a dish to pass to a family gathering. The old default response fires off instantly. Of course, right? I'll handle it. And you think, I'll figure it out. I know that I'm working overtime that week. I know that my work schedule is bonkers. I'm actually putting in 65 hours at the office, and I know that the kids have this and that. But you know what? Yes, I'll figure it all out. That's the automatic response. But if in that moment you were actually able to pause and ask, is this something I'm actually choosing, or am I just repeating what I've always done? You could uncover or discover something interesting. It could be that maybe you genuinely want to bring something because you love cooking for people, or you wanted to try out a new recipe. That would be a real choice then. And it feels completely different once you actually know that it is a choice. I am choosing this. But it could also be that maybe you realize you're saying yes purely because saying anything else has never occurred to you as an option. And that's worth noticing too, even if you still end up bringing the dish. The point isn't that the answer that you come up with means that there has to be a different outcome. Sometimes you'll ask the question and you'll land right back on the same decision that you would have made anyway, on default mode. But there's a real difference between doing something because it's simply what you do and then doing the exact same thing because you looked at it honestly and chose it. The first one of those options is default mode. And the other is what it looks like to live from intention. From the outside, the end result looks identical. But from the inside, they feel like two completely different lives. Here's another example that hits a little bit closer to home for a lot of us. Let's say that your phone buzzes with a text late in the evening, and your hand reaches for the phone before you even consciously decide whether or not you want to answer. The reflex is to answer immediately, that you are always available, to never just let something sit unread, and that texts rarely get examined in this way. It's just what you do. But what if you were to ask the question just once? If you do, you might discover that your immediate availability was never actually required by anyone but the belief itself, the belief that says, this is what I do. The world, more often than not, can wait until morning. You just never stop to check. And before you hear what we're talking about today as one more thing to get wrong or to get right, please don't hear it that way. This isn't about becoming perfect. This isn't about saying no to everything either. This isn't about becoming someone your family doesn't recognize. That's not what we're after. But it is about building awareness. It is about waking up to some degree. It's about noticing. It's about realizing that you actually have more choices than you actually thought you did. Some days you'll still choose to do the hard thing that's going to really put you in a bind. But now you'll be choosing it on purpose, not because your default settings made the decision for you. And I want to make sure that you really are hearing me clearly today, because I know how easy it would be to hear all of this and turn it into one more standard to measure yourself against. Am I being intentional enough today? Did I catch every default belief before it ran the show for me? That's not what our conversation today is about. This isn't a new performance metric to measure yourself with. It's simply an invitation to notice a little bit more often than you used to. When you answer, are you doing so out of intention because you would choose it? Or are you doing it because it's what you've always done? Some days you'll catch yourself in that mid-autopilot mode, and you'll have the presence of mind to pause and ask yourself, do I really want to do this? Do I really have the bandwidth for this? Do I really have the capacity for this? And other days, you'll realize 12 hours later that you spent the whole day running on default without noticing that you were doing so even one time. Both of those days are going to be completely normal when you have awareness. Because awareness isn't a switch. It's not like a light switch that you flip on or off. And you certainly don't flip it and it permanently stays on. It's more like a muscle that you build slowly. And like any muscle, it gets stronger the more you use it. Not the more you punish yourself for the times that you forget to use it. So I hope that it feels a little bit less like the goal is to get to some finish line where I am now seeing myself and the decisions that I make completely accurately all the time. And you're seeing it more like a skill that you're going to practice, this building of awareness. You're never going to reach a point where you fully arrive at the place where you are choosing everything from intention and not from default mode. Because in reality, we're going to slip back into default mode. We all do. The goal isn't to never make choices out of default mode. It's to simply notice more often when you're doing it. And as time goes by, you'll notice it a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. And once you start seeing default mode, I promise you, you're going to start seeing it other places. Not just in the big obvious places, but in kind of the nooks and crannies of life too. For instance, in your marriage, it might sound like automatically taking on the emotional temperature of the relationship. In your family, it might sound like managing everyone else's feelings, smoothing over conflicts before they can ever fully come to the surface. And again, you didn't choose any of these because it was your job, but because somewhere along the way, it just became the role that you play in these relationships, in these settings. In friendships, it could be that you are always the one who's reaching out first, who remembers the birthdays and who checks in. While at the same time, you're quietly wondering somewhere in there whether anyone would reach for you in the same way that you've always reached for them. And what if you stopped doing it? Would anyone notice? I think it's worth sitting with for a second because it's so easy to mistake your autopilot decisions for generosity. When it comes to friendships and reaching out first, it really isn't a problem. But If you've never actually tested what happens when you stop being the one to reach out, if the pattern has simply just kind of gone unquestioned for years, you don't actually know whether that relationship is genuine friendship or if it's just habits that are keeping those relationships alive. It's not necessarily a comfortable place to be where you're wondering which it is, but it is a super honest place to be rather than just assuming without ever questioning that you know the answer. It's worth looking into. What about when it comes to food? What does it look like to live in default mode when it comes to food? It can sound like we're just eating whatever we can grab out of the refrigerator, or we're eating whatever is left after everyone else eats, or reaching for something out of stress rather than hunger, just in that autopilot sort of way, without ever pausing to notice what you actually want or need in that moment. Default mode when it comes to your adult kids, it could show up as still stepping up to fix things that they're capable of handling themselves. Because stepping back, it feels unfamiliar. Even though they haven't really needed you to fix things in years, again, it's just what you've always done. In the workplace setting, it can look like saying yes to every extra project, because turning one down feels like admitting that you can't do it all, even when your plate is already completely full. Even around guilt itself, default mode actually has some sort of script. Feeling guilty automatically the moment that you rest, the moment that you say no, the moment that you spend money or time on yourself, not because you actually did anything wrong, but because guilt has simply become the reflexive response, that's something to notice. For most of us, that reflex response is wired in so deeply that it fires before you've even had a chance to ask whether it makes sense. Now, I'm not walking through all these different real-life scenarios to make you feel stressed or to make you feel like you're failing in some way. I'm walking through these real-life examples because I want you to see how far default mode can reach. It's not a single habit that touches one small area of your life. It's not one small habit that you can fix and then move on from. It truly is a lens. It's how you intake information, all the information that's coming to you from the world around you. And once you kind of have this default mode lens, that's going to be how you react and respond. It's going to be reflected in the decisions that you make, in the things that you do and don't do. But I want you to have that lens of awareness of what default mode is and how it's been showing up for you and how it might show up in the future. Because when you have that lens, the lens of, I want to notice default mode. I want to notice when I'm just reacting instead of choosing. Once you have that lens, you'll start noticing all kinds of places where you are reacting out of reflex. You'll find many more places than you ever expected to find it. Default mode is a belief system that you likely never chose. Again, thoughts like, if I don't do it, nobody's going to do it, they stopped sounding like beliefs long ago and started sounding like facts or truth. And that is why they are so powerful. And exactly why also they're worth questioning, no matter how long they've been present. Default mode isn't a bad thing. It helped you survive. Hard seasons probably. But that doesn't mean that it should keep leading the way. The habits that made you dependable and capable, they were never wrong. But at the same time, they weren't built to be permanent. Confusing familiar with healthy is how so many of us get stuck running an old operating system long after it has stopped serving us and has started sabotaging us. And so the real question in all of this isn't what should I do differently? It's whether you're even making choices at all. Am I choosing this? Or am I simply repeating what I've always done? That question, multiple times a day, can turn automatic living, autopilot living, into a real decision, even when the decision ends up being the exact same one that you would have made on autopilot. You are still making it from a place of choosing and intention. Know that awareness, the awareness that we've built here today and throughout the last several conversations that we've had, awareness doesn't fix everything, but it hands you a choice that you didn't have before. You don't need a perfect life or an overhauled plan. You just need to start noticing where you've been running on autopilot instead of living on purpose, just one moment at a time, without turning noticing itself into one more thing to get right or wrong. Friend, I'm fairly certain that many of us have spent years, decades maybe, living by default. Not because we wanted to or because we chose it, but because life happened while we were busy responding to it. But here's the hope that I want to give you today. The moment that you become aware of your defaults, you no longer are completely controlled by them. You don't have to overhaul everything. You don't have to figure everything out today. You just have to start noticing. Notice the thoughts. Notice the assumptions. Notice the places where you're running on autopilot instead of making intentional choices. Because every intentional life, it really begins the same way. It's not with a perfect plan, but it begins with awareness. And when it comes to default mode, no one else is going to notice that you're in default mode. You're going to have to be the one who notices. But the cool part in that is that you don't have to wait for someone else to give you permission to live differently. You can choose to begin today, one thought at a time, with one decision, with one intentional choice at a time. Now, I want to say something about the series of conversations that we've had, the last 5 conversations. In the beginning, we started with a simple question. Does this deserve the best of me? And that question led us into resentment and the invisible cost of every decision. And from there into a season that finally asked something different of you, and now we're here. And we're really at this deepest layer that is underneath all of it. Every single one of these conversations was really pointing at the same thing. You've been living so much of your life on autopilot. I talk about this as living in the back seat versus the driver's seat. And this happens not because you're careless, but because nobody ever told you there was 2 different seats. And because nobody ever handed you permission to slow down and actually take a look at what's happening. If you go back through all of these conversations in order, you're going to notice something. Every one of our conversations handed you a different question, but they were really all variations on one theme. Does this deserve the best of me? Have I been leaving myself out of the decision? What is this actually costing me? Am I pushing harder because it's the right strategy for me still, or just because it's the only one I know? And finally, am I choosing this, or am I simply repeating what I've always done? There's 5 questions throughout these 5 conversations, and there's one underlying invitation with all of them. Stop running on autopilot. Start living like the woman who is actually in the driver's seat of her own life. I've given you permission to do that. You've always had the permission, but hear me say that today. Maybe you've just needed to hear someone say it out loud. Friend, if you want to go deeper on these concepts, make sure to follow the show notes below. There, I've got a link for you for one of the freebies that I've recently created, and it's called How to Get Relief from Everything You're Carrying. It's a great awareness tool for you that will help you start building some of that awareness that we've been talking about today and throughout all of the conversations we've had in this series. So friend, until we talk again, make it an intentional day.